Hello and welcome to the last of our 3 Carbonless Leadership panels. Now, in this series so far, we have been considering how the corporate sector and the financial sector view the challenge of carbon mitigation and how they can play a part in delivering us to net zero. But as important as those sectors are, no sector is as significant as government. Politicians can influence, demand, even mandate action among all the other sectors. And the scope of government influence is enormous, covering all aspects of the challenge before us. Governments can use top-down diktats and bottom-up incentives to encourage carbon reduction. They can promote renewable energy through taxation measures. They can set standards for energy conservation. And they can impose regulations for the protection of the environment and the control of land use, which are often much neglected elements of the battle against carbon. But what is the proper role for the government? Should legislation and regulation be the primary tools for tackling climate change? Or should governments prioritize market mechanisms to try and address the carbon problem? One thing is for sure, political uncertainty or delayed government action must surely be inconceivable. A lack of clear direction leads to greater uncertainty, which leads to greater risk, and risk means higher costs for the private sector and therefore less and less effective action. Now, these are all very complex issues that have been debated within policy circles for, well, decades. And we're not here to solve them all today, but we are here to try and put some of them in context and perhaps sketch a framework for understanding the challenges that we can take into the Carbonless Forum on March the 31st. So joining me now to help put some of the detail into the subject and draw those lines are my guests today. They are Christine Loh. She has been one of the most well-known public figures in Hong Kong and much of Asia for more than 30 years now. Currently Chief Development Strategist at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. She was previously the Undersecretary for the Environment in the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region Government's Environment Bureau. She is also the founder of the Civic Exchange, which is a public policy think tank in Hong Kong. I'm also joined by Sohail Hasnie, a 20-year veteran of the Asian Development Bank, where he is a principal energy specialist with a special focus on Central and West Asia. He's also a blogger and a podcaster and a champion of innovative renewable energy solutions in Asia and of innovators all around the world. And Elaine Cheung is an operating partner at Singapore's Temasek, where she's building a company that she says will change what consumers eat and how food is produced. She's also a non-executive director at the WWF, an independent expert advisor to the board of the UN World Food Programme, and she also holds numerous other directorships and positions. Panel, thank you very much indeed for joining me today. It's great to chat with you. Sohail, I'll come to you because I just want you to give me an overall sketch of how you see the Asian landscape in terms of regulatory advance. You know, a lot of people think that Asia is the big problem in the carbon landscape, and it surely is, but they also don't give much credit, I suppose, for the efforts that Asian governments have been making. And we've seen a lot of exchange ETS schemes being put into place. We've seen a lot of activities to try and think about these things. None of them, it must be said, particularly well organized as such. But give me a sense of your feeling of how Asian governments view the carbon challenge and how seriously they take it.
Well, good morning, everyone. Asia is also changing. One aspect is very important, that Asia has the largest younger population, if you like, and young people, as we found out, do care about climate change. So what I see that Asia not only bringing a lot of these technologies, especially for renewable energy. It was mostly driven by the low solar panels, low price solar panels coming out of China, and the large electric vehicle projects that's now being proposed in India and many other places across Asia. So Asia is not only bringing the technology. One major changes that's happened is the engagement of the younger people, especially through social media. There is, of course, a good side of social media as well. We tend to hear a lot of the bad side. So I think that broader engagement has taken place, and governments are slowly changing. While people will say, okay, the largest number of coal plants that are being developed are in India and China, and Indonesia. But if you dig a little bit more, you will see these are the countries also developing a very large scale renewable energy project. I think just a few days ago, Malaysian government did a tender for almost 800 plus megawatt project and received a very low price, I think below 5 cents. So this benchmark helps other countries to get engaged. I think Asia will bring a lot of energy into this big train that we all need to board called climate change. I'm very optimistic.
Give me a couple of words more on why you're optimistic. I mean, let's look at Kazakhstan for a moment, because that's within your area of interest. Kazakhstan introduced an ETS scheme in 2013. You've been involved in some solar projects over there. I just want to get a gut sense of whether governments are seeing this as something that is going to mitigate their development policies, because obviously the key element in government minds is poverty reduction, is bringing their economies and their populations to a place where they can be comfortable. And in a lot of minds, the carbonless agenda is still something that actually threatens or at least slows that down. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, what's happening to the Central Asian countries, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, these are the fossil fuel rich countries. A lot of their export relies on fossil fuel. The governments have strategies to diversify away from fossil fuels because it's a single source. Now, what the government's doing in addition to that as well, they looked at it from the sort of economics 101, why you want to generate a coal plant or a gas-fired electricity even, where you see that globally the market is changing. And also prices, like Uzbekistan did a very large tender of a solar a few years ago to achieve a very low price that shattered the mindset of everyone else. So people are looking at those aspects. So government's thinking is changing, not because that the big factor that the Stone Age came to an end, because not just because that they ran out of stone, they saw the light. There's a new technology. I think that penny has dropped in many cases of the countries where they look at the 5-10 year horizon, because these are the countries who does serious central planning, and they see the shift away from the traditional trajectory. And I actually am presenting at a conference this afternoon in Turkmenistan, similarly with a very large senior people attending, just to shake up the mindset and telling people, saying, hey, and people know that's what I've been asked to speak, saying things are changing. We have to think differently, because tomorrow is not going to be an extension of yesterday. And that has dropped not only directly into the senior official you speak to, you will see even large industry associations. Writing is on the wall and everyone's seeing it. And as I mentioned at the beginning, that the younger people's engagement has been really big in this process.
Fantastic. Christine, let me come to you. Hong Kong has been very active in promoting governance-led initiatives to address this issue. Tell me a little bit about the perspective from Hong Kong.
Well, actually, I'd rather talk about the initiative from China, because that really is the giant. And Hong Kong is a fundraising center, and we can talk about that. But
yeah, great. I mean, certainly China is definitely the elephant in the room to a large extent. But just clear up what the relationship there is. I mean, the Hong Kong government has taken its own measures. Are they a consequence of China policy? Are they independent from China policy? Just tell me how that governance process works in that context.
Okay, well, first of all, I'll say Hong Kong is 7.4 million people. China is 1.4 million people, a billion people, and Hong Kong is a part of China. So I think we need to take that into account. Now, Hong Kong, under its political construct, can have its own policies. So if it doesn't want to follow Chinese policies on climate change, on energy and whatever, it could. But I think if we go back to what Sohail was also saying, I actually think up until now, you could say that the whole discussion about climate change and sustainability has been led by the West. And whilst I think the Europeans and the Americans are, still very dominant in this area, Asia is now a part of the discussion. But the discussion about these matters and how we're going to get there to net zero, it's going to be different from the discussion and the narratives from the West. So in Asia, I think it's important to look at China, because what it is putting out right now is development is important. And I think every government in Asia will say development is our priority. But China is now saying, well, my development path for the next 40 years is going to be via net zero. So this means a fundamental shift in its industry, in its technology, R&D, and pretty much everything else. So Asia is now saying our future growth path, it's going to be a fusion of technology, digitalization, net zero, and as Sohail said, these are the sort of things that are inspiring young people. They're good for business. Right. So the discussion about what Asia is going to do and the way they're going to do it, because again, we have forms of government and economies that are different from the ones in Western Europe and in North America.
And so I want to explore that a little bit in some detail in a moment. But just on a couple of points that you've made. Firstly, the point that you made about China. I just want to put that in the context of what Sohail was talking about, and that is the real gut level commitment in terms of how does one balance the development agenda versus the environmental agenda, and how committed they are. Because the Chinese government has been really quite outstanding in what it's been saying to a large extent. But last week there was this moment where in the 5-year plan, people started saying, well, actually the commitments and the action announced in the 5-year plan, there's a little bit of gray area between that. So just give me your sense as to the real extent of the commitment that they've been making.
Oh, huge. Because I think if you take sort of the media highlights, first of all, did they stop saying when they will cap coal? Did they say when they will stop building another coal plant? Then if you were looking for these specifics, well, they weren't there. But if you were looking at the 14 5-year plan as a whole, and also what government said before, during, and afterwards, you see a picture where, China's trying to shift this big ship towards net zero. And, you can expect many more things to come out. So we're going to have to hear from the provinces. We already heard from the China National Coal Association that they're going to close down more coal plants. So I think there'll be many, many things to shift this big ship around. But China is not yet ready to just say what the West wants it to say, in fact, which is the indicator of when are you going to stop using coal? When are you going to stop doing this? Because the picture is actually much more complex.
Let's just bring Elaine in for a quick introductory word or two. Elaine, you and I are sitting here in Singapore, which is in many ways unique in this context. The level of development of this country relative to most of the other Asian countries is utterly different, and the level of commitment and activity has been different too. Now you're sitting in an interesting space where you're not in government, but you're annexing with government. Just give me your sense of from the nexus between the private sector activity that you're being guided into by government policy and where you see the Singapore situation. Just give us your sense of governance and policy in this context.
Recently, I asked a deputy minister about why isn't that Singapore have a target? And she basically said, well, we're researching to make sure that whatever target we're going to set out to do, we're going to reach it or beat it. And so her challenge to corporates is that you don't need to wait for that government target. You can set your own target, be a thought leader. And that really resonated. And if we kind of look at Temasek, that we set out a really ambitious goal to halve our carbon emission of our portfolio by 2030 and on our way to net zero by 2050. And so in many ways, where the food platform that in my mandate is trying to build is really looking at what's the awareness. And I think COVID has kind of like smack in the middle of our faces that, wow, food security is a big issue. or the fact that having local production of food becomes a natural, where we play becomes a natural carbon emission reduction. And so that really drives the choices of where we want to invest, as well as where we want to build companies to invest. And in many ways, I'm an advocate that corporates should proceed not rather than waiting for government. But taking my food platform example, we say we've created awareness, we put into action of where we want to play. But mainly is that, driving behavioral change of customers is so important that sometimes private companies can't do it by themselves. And so let's take the food security, where we set out that we want to have 30 by 30% of our food will be locally produced within by 2030. And so here we are trying to create companies of how we produce food, whether it is through vertical farming or through aquaculture or even cell-based meat. But to get that to a price point that consumers can afford to do, we really need to collaborate together with government, because people need to understand that there's a cost to that food security. And without that, you could have meat that is like $100,000 a pound and nobody's going to buy that and eat that. But if people adopt that, make it affordable and adopt it, then the volume itself will naturally drive down the cost. So it's become the chicken and egg. So if the government policies or advocacy can actually help us enable us towards that journey.
Can you give me a sense of the balance there, Elaine? And I want Christine to sort of address this as well in a moment, but the balance between government and private sector involvement. As I said at the beginning, government involvement can either be top down or bottom up, or at least those are a couple of the options. In Singapore, do you think that the balance is tilted one way or another? Is the government preferring a bottom-up, industry-involved kind of approach to this, or are they happy to lay down the regulations? Because it's an important question in terms of speed of activity, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. And I think when we look at the government, like the enabling the action that they do. So, for example, the Monetary Authority of Singapore have developed a set of guidelines that requires banks to embed environmental risk policies into the risk management framework. So there are top-down, let's say, policies in place, but to me, the main thing is about where is it that consumers and corporates will drive the actual actions. So let's take in outside of Singapore, I understand the Microsofts and Unilevers and Amazons of the world have set down billion-dollar funds aside to support innovation and technology for sustainability. So in many ways, the choices that Temasek is making in their portfolio investments is that we do look for low emission, we look for low emission, resource efficient economies in the areas of energy, food, waste, water, urban development. So I think all of that, the policies themselves, or the targets themselves, I should say, really drives the choices of where we're going to action and invest in. And so I think that is a give and take. And I'm just a firm believer that even though I believe it's corporate-led, but it's also government-enabled. But if we're going to wait for the policies to come through before we action, then we will slow down the achievement of the SDGs. Mm-hmm.
So, Christine, you mentioned a moment ago that that the approach in Asia is going to be different to the West, and I'm guessing that this is one of the aspects of that difference is the nature of governance in a broader sense. Do you think in the China context the top-down approach is being favored?
Well, I think China is your ultimate state-led system, and it sits sort of on the opposite end of what you might call the classic US, UK kind of system. But anyway, we're not here to argue about ideology. It is what it is, and China believed that the state-led system, what is the state-led system there? And so its policies are very important. If the government doesn't set targets, it doesn't have timelines, it doesn't have very specific regulations and laws, it's very hard to move this very large ship. So in fact, one of the things that China has done is in setting environmental, energy, and climate targets, these are now mandatory. So that means that every bit of the political administrative system in China will have to meet these targets. So China believes that only in this kind of way can it move the ship.
So Hale, we've seen where this can derail. I mean, the Kyoto Agreement initially was set up with mandatory targets for countries, and it failed to gain any solution. In fact, the US bailed out of the Kyoto Agreement starting because of that. And we had to come to the Paris Agreement, where setting of targets at nation level was made individual choice, because they knew that it was almost impossible to get global agreement on some of these things if the countries themselves and the governments themselves didn't have control over their own activities. So just give me your sense as to what the proper balance here is between government and the private sector in getting us to net zero.
Well, you know, when Kyoto happened and today it's a very different world. Australia was not fully part of that Kyoto in that sense. I mean, in general, public. Now, Australia has the highest per capita rooftop solar in the world. So the world is a very different place. At that time, it was climate change was discussion among few academics. It really did not impact our life. People did not believe what happened. Today, right now, everybody understands that climate change is a problem. Some are super vocal about it, others are not. And now I pick up the point that I made earlier, that the central government was giving incentive to move people together, and what Elaine also said, corporate led but government enabled. Now it has become the case for climate mitigation side of it, especially on the energy side. Look what's happening in the electric vehicle. Every Tom, Dick, Harry wants to buy an electric vehicle. It was not the case even just 5 years ago. People worry that, will my car be a stranded asset? I may not be able to sell a fossil fuel car. Globally, all countries are banning gasoline cars beyond 2030. So I think the world is a very different place. Right now, corporates are leading investment away from fossil fuel. I won't say mostly because of climate change, because nobody wants to lose their money, no? You don't want to invest into something that will be stranded tomorrow. Stranded asset becoming a big risk. So I think right now the government's role has changed quite dramatically in a way. I personally believe that time is now. Climate change will go bottom up, as you mentioned also earlier. Yes, before it was the few government getting together saying, how do we motivate all our citizens? Now the citizens are getting together saying, how do we motivate the government as well? So in the middle, the corporates are making a judgment. Yes, we need incentive from the government to maybe move a bit faster, but at the same time, they realize that the demand coming from their fossil fuel-led product from these customers are changing as well. So I think that mix has dramatically changed from Kyoto yesterday or day before yesterday, Paris yesterday, and where we are today.
Okay, let's carry on.
Can I just come in? Taimur, can I just
Please
come
go
in
ahead.
and say there is a difference between domestic mandatory targets and multilateral agreements. The problem with multilateral agreements is we can have agreements, but domestic implementation is left to the domestic governments. So, but if a particular country has policies or maybe pass laws and you know, taxes and whatnot, right? Whatever it is that they do to get to the end point, the outcome that they want, very often within that jurisdiction, it is possible to enforce these outcomes.
So we'll speak a little bit more about the role of the international community. I mean, you know, these protocols, Kyoto, Paris. We're coming up to Glasgow at the end of this year. The international community is playing a big role in that. I mean, do you see this as being problematic?
No, I don't actually. I think what we are all saying is that at the international level, because climate change is your kind of ultimate global problem, it's going to happen to everybody. And therefore, everybody needs to get together to understand how to do this. Kyoto failed because at that time, some countries hadn't even quite really accepted the science of climate change, including very major economies. But today, I think the world is different. Going into Glasgow later on this year, it's going to be a big rah-rah show, and people are going to put more commitments on the table. I think the issue that people genuinely, should care about is whether these are going to be enforced domestically, and what may be the technology or what may be the alignment of different types of policies and public-private sectors, investors, local campaigns that involves the people can really push this agenda, because there's some urgency. We need to get there by a certain date. Otherwise, we are threatened by existential crises.
This suggestion that things have changed since Kyoto, things have changed since Paris. I mean, it's fairly clear that it has. I'm wondering whether the change is a consequence of government action, or is government responding to change in public perception? Elaine, you talked about government enabled and private sector led, but the government does have a role in promotion and publicity. And I'm thinking here in Singapore, they're actually fairly active in that, aren't they? I mean, the government is taking a very activist stance in promoting the idea of engagement, of understanding, of education, and all that kind of thing, don't you think?
Absolutely. I mean, I think I think being in Singapore, having recently moved here, I find that the government support system is amazing. But then all the work that they're trying to do is still looking at supporting investments in innovation and technology that can actually help solve the problem. Let me give you an example. We all say that market studies will say that everybody wants to buy an environmentally friendly cleaning product. But when we kind of look at the purchasing pattern of, globally, not just only in Singapore, is that a lot of times people actually don't buy that eco-friendly product, cleaning product. And then so the role of business to try to figure out, well, why aren't people buying it when everyone knows that it's good for them? So you drill down on it, it's like, actually it's not as tough of a cleaner as is with other cleaning products. And so it's up to the business itself to find the innovations to figure out how do you solve that problem. Because if you can solve that problem, then you drive the right action that can contribute towards buying that cleaning product that is better produced, better for the environment in whichever way it is. And so I think the Singapore government does really focus on trying to understand what is it that we're trying to solve, and then putting, I guess, like the support behind those solutions that can help us get there. But I think it takes the companies to really help the customers find that solution so that the customers will adopt it.
Promotion of education, Sohail, is just one way that the government can affect perceptions. Another way is how they affect the market activity. Now, in the area where you operate, and you mentioned that a lot of these countries are dependent upon resources from the ground, energy subsidies are still very common in a lot of the fossil fuel producing countries. According to the IEA, more than 25 countries are providing energy subsidies to their fossil fuel sectors. I think that the amount of subsidies talked about ranges a lot, but the IEA's number is $400 billion every year. 5 of the countries that provide subsidies are Asia, China and India and Indonesia being the most significant on that list. So just talk about the perspective of how government involvement in distorting the playing field, if you like, needs to be considered.
Well, firstly, you asked what's the role of the international organizations in this change climate when everyone is aware of climate change and wants to do something about it. I think that's where these large companies, not companies, large international organizations like Green Climate Fund comes into place. How do we take money from the developed countries, bringing in incentives at the government level, at the country level to do large projects? So like I just saw Green Climate Fund just received $1.2 billion from the new US government. Of course, that will help Green Climate Fund to come to these countries, which has huge subsidy in, say, in some sectors. That has been there because that was the only solution to develop the economy. Now, in some of those countries, market is not fully established for renewable. And there's money coming from green climate funds of the world or clean technology funds of the world, not only helps these governments to come up with the new policies, now they just want to do something, but it also brings in technology with it. So I think that's where the roles are right now. And subsidy per se, I mean, these large subsidy numbers are based on historical valuation of these assets. I would say some of those value of these, especially fossil fuel assets, if you do mark to market today, do an asset revaluation, those numbers will be quite significantly less. But definitely subsidy helps people to make the right decision, because early adopters have moved on now. Early adopters countries or early adopters customers, but middle part is still thinking, who might need a bit of incentives, but to get to climate change within 2 degrees and meet the Paris commitment, we need everyone. So
I'm not saying that government subsidies are necessarily a bad thing, because we see promotion of renewables as being part of that distortion of the playing field too. But it's just interesting again as how the public perception goes. I was at the COP conference in Doha in 2012, I think it was, and all the talk was about promoting fossil tar sands. All the exploration for tar sands and fracking was still getting a lot of investment at the time, and then as the solar panel industry in China started to grow, people started complaining about the Chinese government distorting the market by promoting solar panels. So one way or the other, that kind of engagement is absolutely necessary. But I guess my question was, is it, if we're talking about government enabled but private sector delivered, should we actually be talking about, no, what we really need is for the government to really start renewing or at least re-examining some of the activities it takes in the subsidization of these kind of industries? Christine, how does your microphone's off, Christine?
Oh, sorry. It's just a matter of what kind of economics you're used to talking about. So subsidies is not a bad word. Tax is not a bad word. You're trying to internalize externalities, right? In the language of economists. In certain jurisdictions, like in the US, subsidies and taxation are very negatively conceived, but in other economies that's not necessarily so. So I think what we're really talking about is, what is the new outcome that you want? You want to divert investments that are going into less sustainable, high carbon investments. You want to divert that into something else. People are not yet doing it so naturally. So you need new regulations, new laws, you need subsidies, you need taxation to actually shift that ship. And that is what we're seeing. So, you have countries like Germany that has gone first, now in China, and in other places, we're going to see it happen. But if we're using one set of assumptions about what is right in market capitalism into other systems, we kind of end up having this kind of discussion that I don't think is very outcome oriented.
Well, let's be outcome oriented. Let's start talking about what we think the proper role of governments should be and what the policy discussions should center on. Elaine, thoughts on this?
I definitely think that, governments can play a role in raising awareness as well as setting that commitment goal. And then that is the path forward. We directionally want to go right and not go left. So everybody should be, going towards that right side and making that choice of how to use resources towards that right direction. And then it is still looking at, how do we create innovation that helps towards that right direction? How do we shift the investments from, fossil fuels and investment in renewable? And so it's that, but what does renewable actually mean? So it has to be some form of change, and its technology and innovation will help get to that solution. So I think it's solution-based outcomes. The solution drives the outcome. Commitments might not necessarily drive the outcome because it has to be enabled by a solution.
Yeah, and the enablement portion again coming up. I mean, the government's role, and Singapore has been extraordinary in this. I think the ability to create national roadmaps to be able to guide that thinking is something Singapore has been extraordinarily good at. But there are many other aspects of this. Sohail, what do you think are the essential elements that governments should now be considering, and how can they be that force for change?
I think one important aspect in government's engagement is to also redirect some of these concessional funds that are globally available to bring in new technology, engage entrepreneurship, high-tech products. Like Elaine mentioned, that now that we are setting a direction to enable everyone to move into that direction, that needs funding, especially concessional funding, which these large organizations like Green Climate Fund and Clean Technology Funds have. Asian Development Bank, World Bank, we all have a dedicated fund trying to support innovation and technology. I think some of the government's role also is to bring those funding available, tell people, and also do technology transfers, because if you're an entrepreneur sitting in the middle saying, okay, I can do this and I can do this, and suddenly you realize that, okay, doing the traditional way, there is a bit of risk, but if I take this direction, it's little expensive, I fully don't know, but then you realize there's a government support available, you will take this part and everyone will come and join you. I think that's where we are headed now. Government's role is to enable private sectors, now that they are interested into doing something, maybe with some concessional fund. And then Christine correctly said that the priorities has changed, that has to be mirrored through the change in actions, right? Take some of the subsidies and do a path saying, okay, we will take this subsidy away from there and we are redirecting that so that you don't change the goalpost dramatically. And I think many governments have done that.
And Christine, your thoughts on we're going to have the Carbonless Asia Forum at the end of March, and the idea is to try and get more deeply into exploring what are the essential elements that should be on the agenda. From your perspective, what are they? What is the path to action here? What is the proactive stance?
Yes, as Sohail said, first of all, I think every jurisdiction needs a roadmap. So a roadmap must have timelines and targets. And it must also be able to say how government policy will facilitate that roadmap and that reaching a particular target. And then I think some governments are very good at corralling and bringing people together, or maybe the private sector, whomever actually is able to bring people together. And I have one more T, so you have target, timeline, together, and then you need transparency, right? Because you have to have accountability. So, for example, how, we need to define what's green and sustainable and what's low carbon. And all this is being worked out, I think, under the sort of banner of green finance. So I would suggest that taking the 4 Ts, having a clear path, and kind of energize, make people enthusiastic to be a part of this.
And let's finish off then with the other side of the equation as to the influence on government by people. I mean, we've touched on the idea of the private sector playing a role in this and leading in a large way. the transition to net zero. But what about the individuals? I mean, we are living in an area where governance doesn't often involve the input of the larger population. So Elaine, I mean, you were talking about business being involved. What role do you think the general public needs to be playing in helping to draw up these national roadmaps, these targets, these benchmarks that government is setting for us?
Vote.
But I mean, go ahead.
No, I think it's been individual. I mean, I guess it's always about supply and demand, and if there's a demand on looking at, we need to get to a goal of SDGs, and that is driven by the consumer demand. And I hope that governments do listen to that individual. And so the work at like WWF, we work with the ground up. We work with school children to make sure that they understand the implication of their choices, so it becomes a journey. And we hope that as they grow up, that their voices are heard and that demands are met. And so I see that more individually, to say that's what I would expect from my government, is articulate my voice, but I need to be educated of how to use my voice.
I wonder if that applies to all the countries across the region. Sohail, you spoke at the beginning about how public perceptions have changed, about how there's a big difference in what people are talking about and what the young people in particular want. To what extent do you think young people can play a part in shaping policy across the region?
Well, young people are going to run the country. They will decide how much of your pension will be invested and where. So let's not undermine them. I think on a serious note, young people already quite vocal. You see Greta Thunbergs of the world and others. I brought in once 2 speakers in one of the forum about electric vehicle. Their combined age was 35. And I told the audience that, yes, we cannot go to 2050 today, but these are the professionals who will be making decision in 2050. They will not be here another 10 years, but this is important you listen. And you won't believe the things these 2 young girls, I had to bring their mothers along because they're minors, what they said. So I think that is happening through social media. Even politicians, you name it, these may not be voter, but they are already influencer thanks to social media. So I think the governments of today cannot just listen to the well-established institutions and the same people they have been listening to for a very long time, because people don't have patience. I think people are becoming very impatient, and you saw what young people can do. So government in a policy level, in the public consultation, I think they have to bring everyone else into the picture as well, I think. And
let me just lob one final quick question at you, Sohail. I mean, if there is one urgent step that policymakers as a general category, and I realize that particularly in the Asian context, that's really a little bit stretched. But if there was one step that you think policymakers need to prioritize as we go forward, what would that be?
Is to create a sense of urgency for climate change in the country, because climate change is not just an emotional thing or environmental thing. The countries, especially fossil fuel countries, that's what I tell some of the client governments, that if you do not act now, you will be sitting with lots of stone, and Stone Age came to an end, not because they run out of stone. So I think that's some message needs to go everywhere, that are you investing in the wrong assets, whether it's a technology, training, infrastructure, where your money is going. So that sense of urgency, I think the one single thing that penny needs to drop.
And Christine, let's have your final thoughts too, including the role of the public and the single step that policymakers really need to take, and particularly in the China context, because as we said, China really is the key and the pivotal figure in this whole conversation.
Right. I think to engage young people, let me touch on that. The first thing I would do is governments are now managing very large pensions, and they don't necessarily encourage people who manage the pension to really give us a choice, a low carbon choice. And the second thing is food. Everybody is very emotional about food waste. This is a great campaign to engage everybody and give everybody that sense of urgency.
Yeah. And your thoughts on what should be the political priorities going forward?
Well, have a target, have a timeline for something. If you can't do net zero yet, but still have something. How are you going to do energy efficiency? Set targets and timelines.
Fantastic.
4 T's.
Well, folks,
4 T's.
4 T's. Folks, it's been great chatting with you. And as I said at the beginning, I mean, governments have a finger in every single aspect of this conversation and need to be involved in every single level of this conversation. And unfortunately, we can't go through all of them. One of the things that I really wanted to touch on, but I think we probably don't have time, is the role of city leaders. I mean, governance at local level is key, because the vast majority of our pollution and our carbon problem comes from urban environments. And as Asia urbanizes so rapidly, it's only going to become worse. That's something we really need to consider in this conversation. But, I think we've aired a few of the topics that are top of mind here, and hopefully we can do more of that when we go into the Carbonless Asia Forum on March the 31st. But thank you guys very much indeed for beginning this conversation and starting to lay the process of laying the groundwork. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I will just close out the show by reminding you the Carbonless Asia Forum is on the 31st of March. Go to CAF21 Live, CAF21.live for more details. Thanks for watching. See you again soon.